Well, good afternoon, everybody, on this rainy day. This is our second lecture in the Winter Wonders series. Uh, and our speaker today, of course, this will be a big treat for all of us, is Barbara Oberlander, um, Emeritus Professor of History from Santa Fe College, and no stranger to ILR, one of our favorite presenters. She's going to be talking about Edith Wilson, as you can see. Um, I think when Barbara speaks, she always brings history to life for us. And she does that through the people who lived in those times. And she's going to do the same thing today. We welcome Barbara and take it away. Thank you.
You at Okamic. It's been a while since I've been here. As many of you know, I am endlessly fascinated by First Ladies. And if you think about it, the office of First Ladies is really somewhat strange because there's nothing provided for this in the Constitution. There is nothing provided for it legally. It is simply a role that has evolved and changed and certainly grown in the 20th century. We have presidential wives acting as partners, acting as advisors, acting as international emissaries, pushing their own favorite program, as, for example, Rosalind Carter did. And there are some people who think that first ladies have had too much influence on their husbands. There's a very interesting book called Hidden Power, which is all about the first ladies of the 20th century. Some of them are criticized for not doing enough. Others are criticized for being too influential. But there is only one first lady in American history who's ever been accused of actually acting as president. And that woman is the subject today, Edith Wilson, the first lady who became acting president. And actually, there should be a question mark after the word president, because some of you at the end of this talk may not see it that way. Oops. Okay, let's try this. Yes, I'll try that. So, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was Woodrow Wilson's second wife. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who was president in the early part of the 20th century, is considered one of our great presidents. He's usually ranked about 10th or 11th by historians and political scientists. He was a two-term president. First victory was in 1912, and he was reelected in 1916. He is the president who led us into World War I. He is the president who had a grand vision of an international organization that would forever end wars. And he's a very interesting man to look at. In terms of his personality, he was the son of a Presbyterian minister, deeply religious. He, in a sense, believed God had ordained him to be president, and God had instructed him on the policies he should follow. He was, by profession, a professor of political science. And his dissertation was made into a book called Congressional Government, which I, as a political science major, was doomed to read in college. I do not recommend it. At any rate, he had his PhD from Johns Hopkins University, later served as president of Princeton, became known as the reform governor of New Jersey, and then on the 46th ballot, he was chosen as the Democratic nominee of 1912. So obviously that means he was not on everybody's mind. He was not the first choice, but he did become president. He was stubborn, determined, and he seemed to many rather cold, aloof, a bit icy in personality. William Allen White said that when you shook Woodrow Wilson's hand, it was like that of, quote, a 10-cent pickled mackerel wrapped in wet paper, unquote. That's quite a description of Wilson's handshake. He was married in 1885. There, very nice portrait of him as president. He was married in 1885 to Ellen Axon, who had been trained at the Art Students League in New York. And she was quite an accomplished painter, as you can see here. There's a very nice portrait of Ellen Wilson and her three daughters. They had three daughters. Here is a photo of the Wilson family in 1912. Two of them would get married, and the third would have a professional career as a singer. She died very soon after Wilson's election. She died in August of 1914 from Bright's disease. It was a terrible loss for Wilson. They had been married 30 years. He was very, very dependent on her. And he said to his personal physician, Dr. Corey Grayson, who will become a major leader in this story, he said, "Oh my God, what am I going to do without Ellen?" He went into a period of serious depression, would kind of wander around the White House. Every now and then he would play a golf game, but it was very, very hard for him. There's another photo of the Wilson family with Ellen standing in the background. He became short-tempered with his staff. They knew that this was a difficult time for him. They tried to, in a sense, bolster his spirits. But if you think about it, her death occurred at a time when World War I was just about starting in Europe, and Wilson was concerned about that. He was involved, even though the United States announced its neutrality. It would be clear we could not stay out of involvement very long. Then in February 1915, coming back from a golf game because it had started to rain, the elevator in the White House opened, and there was his cousin, Helen Bones, with a woman. And Wilson was taken immediately. The woman who would later become his wife was Edith Bowling Galt. Now, Edith Bowling was born in Virginia, just as Wilson had been. She was about 15 years younger than he was. She was the seventh of 11 children. She traced her ancestors, believe it or not, to Thomas Jefferson, Martha Washington, and even Pocahontas. This was the girlhood home of Edith Bowling in Whiteville, Virginia. They lived on the top floor above the store. It was a rather modest background. Here she is at 2 with her siblings. And here she is at 13. She attended 2 years of college, very, very briefly, but really wasn't interested in the academic world. Again, a nice professional photo of Edith. And of course, this is Pocahontas, the wife of John Rolfe. And this is the descent line. You have to keep reading down till you get down to Edith Bowling Wilson. But this is the descent line that they claimed, indicating a percentage of Native American ancestry. You begin at the top and come all the way down. And this is what she looked like as a young woman. She was tall, statuesque, very attractive, very vivacious, very outgoing. And she ended up marrying this man, Norman Galt. Norman Galt owned Galt's department store in Washington, D.C. And Galt's department store in Washington, D.C. was the Tiffany's of its day. It was a very prominent, well-known store that carried very expensive dishes and jewelry and all kinds of things, and it would frequently be visited by presidents' wives. This was their house on 20th Street. And when he died, she had married him at 23, and then he died soon after in 1908. She, Edith, the country girl, inherited the house and the store. And she became quite a successful businesswoman, wealthy in her own right. She would make trips to Europe to buy dresses. She was independent. She had an electric car. She was the first woman in the District of Columbus to earn a driver's license. She would tool around in this car, which went, by the way, 13 miles an hour. And she loved it. You can see in this montage, she was an independent, free-spirited woman of means. And then she met Woodrow Wilson. Now, he was taken with her right away. Here is actually her driver's license from the time when she was tooling around in that electric car. And here is Wilson about the time he met her. Now, the attraction was immediate. He was very taken with her outgoing personality, her vivaciousness, everything about her. And as you can see, she was a very, very attractive woman in her own right. Now, one of the things that has amazed historians, and it particularly amazed the woman who wrote the most recent biography of Edith Wilson, was going to the Wilson Library and reading their correspondence. You think about Wilson as this rather aloof kind of man, and then you look at the correspondence, and it isn't that way at all. From the very first, And it was a very fast courtship because he proposed in less than 2 months. And she demurred. She wasn't sure about this. And at one point, she told him jokingly that she would marry him if he lost the next presidential election because she had no desire to be a first lady. She had not even known who was running in 1912 in the presidential election. Her sister wanted her to watch the inaugural parade. She wasn't interested. She was apolitical in a sense. She was against women getting the right to vote. She was not interested in this. So she demurred at the beginning, and Wilson persisted. From the very beginning, he shared with her the burdens of the presidency. And that meant that he sought her advice on things that were going on politically, on the affairs of state, the sinking of the Lusitania. When he was responding to that, he wrote to her and asked her what she thought of his response. He gave her the secret code for diplomatic correspondence. He had a direct line assigned to them so he could call her directly and not go through the White House switchboard. There was all of that. And even though Teddy Roosevelt said, and Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to say about a lot of people, he said Wilson had, quote, all the passion of an apothecary clerk, unquote. It does not match up with the letters that Woodrow Wilson wrote Edith. I heard a historian very recently, Rachel Roberts, the daughter of Cokie Roberts, say that when she opened up the letters and started to read them, she blushed. She said the letters were steaming and racy, and she couldn't believe that she was reading this. For example, of course, I have to share one of them with you. My noble, incomparable Edith, I do not know how to express or analyze the conflicting emotions that have surged like a storm through my heart all night long. I only know that first and foremost in all my thoughts has been the glorious confirmation you gave me last night, without effort, unconsciously, as of course, all I have ever thought of your mind and heart. You have the greatest soul, the noblest nature, the sweetest, most loving heart I have ever known. And my love, my reverence, my admiration for you have increased in one evening's, as I should have thought, only in a lifetime of intimate, loving association. You are more wonderful and lovely in my eyes than you ever were before, and my pride and joy and gratitude that you should love me with such a perfect love are beyond all expression, except in some great poem which I cannot write. I give you Woodrow Wilson. And this is only a few months after he met her. And the interesting thing is, when she wrote back to him, she said, quote, dearest one, much as I love your delicious love letters that would make any woman proud and happy, I believe I enjoy even more the ones in which you tell me of what you are working on, the things that fill your thoughts and demand your best effort. For then I feel I am sharing your work and being taken into partnership, as it were. I know there are many things you don't care to put on paper for fear that it might fall into other hands, and therefore it is difficult to share your work. But I feel so close when I know what you are doing. So she, in the early letters, almost seems more interested in what he's doing politically than his professed love for her. But it was there. And at one point, he wrote to her, "My love for you has come to me in these days when I seem to be put to the supreme test of my life. You are so fit for a mate for a strong man." So they started to go everywhere together. And if you're interested, you can read the letters. They have been published. And here they are at the World Series in 1915, and Edith is there behind him. You can only see her hat and the flowers. She loved orchids, and he was always giving her orchids. By September, the engagement was public, and here's a newspaper headline. Of course, there had been hints about that before. And one of the funniest and most embarrassing things that happened was that the Washington Post had run an article, and the article was supposed to say, quote, "The president spent much of the evening entertaining Mrs. Galt." There was a typo, and it said, "The president spent much of the evening entering Mrs. Galt." And the Post tried to recall all the newspapers as fast as possible, but some of them actually went onto the newsstands, and there were all these jokes. What did Edith Gall do when Wilson asked her to marry him? And the answer was she fell out of bed. So by the fall of 1915, it was pretty clear that this was a serious relationship. And according to his aides, Wilson could be heard singing "Oh, You Beautiful Doll" around the White House. Wilson's daily letters to her often arrived with packets of state papers with handwritten notes. She would write handwritten notes back, and they would go back to him. They were married quietly in December. But when the engagement was announced, you can imagine the newspapers had a field day with the idea that she was a direct descendant of Pocahontas. And there were photos like this published, Valentine's. There she is again with the orchids. And here is their wedding day. It was a small ceremony in the parlor of Edith's townhouse. And then they went on a 2-week vacation, destination unknown. It was actually Hot Springs, Virginia. And not that many years ago, George Condon in the National Journal did a cartoon and published an article about the Wilson wedding and honeymoon. And what you have are all the reporters following in cars, trying very hard to find out where they're going. Native American gifts like this were sent immediately to Edith Wilson as First Lady because of her Native American background. And once she was First Lady, she actually seemed to enjoy the pomp and circumstance of the role. And there were unusual activities like being honorary president of the Girl Scouts, which it had been a tradition for presidential wives. She did not like to be called First Lady. She wanted to be called Mrs. Wilson. And that's revealing because she saw her duty and her responsibility first to Wilson and then to the country. And this will have an influence on her actions. She referred to Wilson as her Lord and Master, and he called her my little partner. 1916 was a productive year for Wilson. He was reelected, and a lot of very important legislation was passed, including the Federal Reserve Act, which influences all of our lives. But then World War I. Wilson asked for a declaration of war in the spring of 1917, reluctantly, after American ships had been sunk and there seemed to be no other choice. Now, he knew what war meant. Wilson himself hated war. So the only way he could justify it was saying that it would be a moral crusade, that it would be a war to end all wars, and it would bring democracy around the world. When he gave the speech to Congress asking for a formal declaration of war, people applauded. And afterward, he said, "Why are they applauding when my message is a message of death for our young men? How strange to applaud that." So he understood very well. He also said that the Constitution would not survive the war. And by the way, Woodrow Wilson is absolutely right, because during World War I, the Constitution did not survive the war in terms of freedom of speech. Edith's response was to cancel all White House social engagements, big galas, and all of that, to volunteer at a Red Cross station in DC, where soldiers often gathered. She established a Red Cross canteen in the White House, and famously, she grew sheep on the White House lawn during World War I, and you can see the sheep. The idea was that once the sheep had finished grazing and their wool was harvested, that the wool would be sold and the money could be used to help soldiers. And she did raise $100,000. She worked very, very closely with Wilson during the war. And here is a photo of them arriving in New York in 1918 for a Liberty Parade. Just a month before the armistice was declared in November of 1918. And Wilson had already announced his terms for peace. He wanted to personally negotiate, help to negotiate the peace treaty that ended World War I. And so he was going to Europe. He was the first president to really do this kind of thing. And of course, Edith was going with him. So she was the first lady to go abroad in this way. They took the ship, the George Washington, with 11 battleships surrounding them. The interesting thing is, Wilson took Edith with him, but he didn't take a single Republican. For a man who had an advanced degree in political science, the Republicans had taken control of the Senate. I'm sure that many of you know that all foreign treaties have to go through the Senate of the United States, and they require a 2/3 vote. So if you have a Senate controlled by Republicans, you need Republican votes. And he did not take a single Republican with him on this European venture. They were greeted with open arms and incredible treatment everywhere. Here they are with the British royal family. They were the first commoners to actually stay in Buckingham Palace. And there is Edith Wilson on the far left, Wilson in the middle, and George and Mary. They got to Paris. The crowds lined the streets in Paris, threw flowers at their carriage, screamed, "Viva Wilson!" In Rome, people put up candles and said that he was going to bring peace to the world. It was quite a reception. You know, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is usually chained off. They opened it so the Wilson cavalcade could go through. He was hailed everywhere as the man who would bring peace to the world. High expectations in a difficult situation. World War I was a terrible, long war. 41 million casualties, 18 million deaths, an entire generation, really, of young men in Britain and France almost wiped out. And that partially determines their policy as we get closer to World War II. But you can imagine the leaders of those countries came to Versailles wanting revenge, not peace, not a fair, just peace, whatever that means. They wanted to make Germany pay. And as one of the leaders said, here comes Woodrow Wilson, and he's got these 14 points for a lasting peace. God only had 10 commandments. Who does this man think he is? Here they are again in Paris. You can see the reception. And these crowds were not hired to come out. They wanted to see this man. They laid a wreath at the American Cemetery on Memorial Day. But Wilson had to negotiate with these people: Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Orlando, France, Britain, Italy. And here he is with them. Now, he might tower over them in height, but he had a lot of trouble convincing them of his goals to be put in the peace treaty. And the peace treaty of Versailles is one of the reasons many historians think that we have World War II, because it treated Germany very, very harshly. However, when they came back, and they came back with wounded U.S. soldiers again on the George Washington. You can see them standing in the middle there. Wilson had one thing in the Treaty of Versailles that he felt made up for all its problems and difficulties, and that was Article 10. The Treaty of Versailles established something called the League of Nations, and the League of Nations was an international body supposedly dedicated to world peace. Within the covenant of the League of Nations was this statement: the members of the League undertake to respect and preserve against aggression the territorial integrity and political independence of all members. In case of any such aggression or threat or danger, the Council shall advise upon the means by which this obligation shall be fulfilled. Now look at that first sentence again. The members of the League will respect and preserve against external aggression the integrity and independence of all members of the League. As many Republicans read it, this obligated the United States, if we sign this treaty and join the League of Nations, it obligated us in advance to go to war. And that led to incredible opposition. Here's a negative cartoon about the League of Nations. Wilson has laid a very large egg here. The man who led the opposition was a man from my home state of Massachusetts, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. And Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, being a true New Englander, could be every bit as stubborn and determined and righteous as Woodrow Wilson himself. And Lodge was determined that that treaty would not be ratified without being amended to clarify the obligations of the United States. And just to twist the knife a little bit, there were going to be amendments to the treaty, and there were 14 to match Wilson's 14 points. So what ensued was a battle here. And by this time, Wilson was already showing signs of physical strain. He had had what they thought was the flu in France and wasn't quite himself, wasn't quite well, was snapping at people. And people were a little bit worried about him. In early April, while they were there, he had run a fever. And then later that month, he seemed to have what was a mild cerebral incident. And as I said, he snapped at European leaders. For example, at Lloyd George, he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, you make me sick." That was a strange statement coming from Wilson. At any rate, Wilson, instead of trying to negotiate with the Republicans in the Senate, and I am always astounded when I think about this because, as I said, he was a trained political scientist. He knew how Congress worked. He knew what needed to be done. But then there's Wilson's personality. He thought he would take a tour across the United States, speak to the people personally, and get support that would put pressure on the Senate to pass his treaty as it came back from Versailles. What he said was, quote, "The Senate must take its medicine," unquote. So even though his doctor, Grayson, advised him strongly against taking a cross-country trip, Wilson said, quote, "I promised our soldiers when I asked them to take up arms that it would be a war to end all war. And if I don't do all in my power to put the treaty into effect, I will be a slacker and I will never able to look those boys in the eyes. I must go." And so he went on a speaking tour. It was a grueling trip, thousands of miles, dozens of speeches. He grew thinner, started to complain of headaches. He became somewhat out of touch. The headaches got worse. In Pueblo, Colorado, in September, he collapsed. And the train was ordered to go back immediately to Washington, where a few weeks later he suffered a major stroke. Grayson issued this statement that Wilson was a very sick man, that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion, and he needed calming measures around him and rest. Quote, "The President Wilson's condition is due to overwork. The trouble dates back to an attack of flu last April in Paris, from which he never recovered. The president's activities on this trip have overtaxed his strength, and he is suffering from nervous exhaustion. The condition is not alarming, but necessary for his recovery, that he have rest and quiet for a considerable time." So from the beginning, the American public was not told the truth. And when he suffered this major major stroke in early October, it left him partially paralyzed on his left side. It blurred his vision. He had urinary tract infections. He then got the flu. On top of that, he was a very, very ill man. And what begins now is probably one of the most incredible cover-ups in American history. I'm not sure at all it could happen today, although we just saw the whole story about our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, not informing the White House of his disability. But you have to understand the press then was very different. We didn't have the kind of media frenzy that we have today. But there's no doubt that this was a cover-up. For many months, there was not a functioning president. And there was the question of what to do, what to do in this crisis. Now, Edith consulted with Wilson's doctors, and she consulted with his neurologist, Dr. Francis Durkheim, whose papers have recently been published. And she asked him, essentially, what she should do. And he said that Wilson's character and strength were being kept alive by the idea that he was going to recover, that he was going to get the Versailles Treaty ratified, and that if he resigned from the presidency, it would kill him. It would kill him if he had too much stress, so she had to keep him from stress, but it would also do him in if he were forced to resign. So essentially, she was told that she couldn't allow him to be stressed by the cares of the country and the world somehow, and she couldn't allow him to resign by telling him the truth about his condition. So she was in a terrible situation, really. This is Dr. Grayson, his personal physician, and he was also part of this. And so essentially what they did was keep issuing statements that Wilson was getting better and that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion. They didn't really reveal the full extent of the stroke for a very long time. He was not seen in public for 5 months. The members of Congress were not allowed to come and see him. Well, what about the Constitution? There's Article 11, in case of the removal of the president from office, his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. And Congress may by law provide for the case of removal of both the president and vice president, declaring what officers shall then act as president until the disability be removed. Okay. Back to that. But who's supposed to do that? Who's supposed to make that determination? The vice president did not want to do that. He did not want to be president. And so that succession clause was never put into effect. Finally, two senators insisted on coming to see him, Senator Albert Fall and Senator Gilbert Hitchcock. And when they came, Wilson was propped up in bed in a way that his left side, which was paralyzed, was concealed. And Edith placed his right hand on papers. And that's how they saw him. And one of the senators said, "I have been praying for you, sir." And Wilson quipped, "Which way have you been praying?" You know? So he seemed to be okay. But this is what Edith Wilson has written about what she did. "So began my stewardship. I studied every paper sent from the different secretaries of senators and tried to digest and present in tabloid form the things that, despite my vigilance, had to go to the president. I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband." Look at that carefully. This is what she's saying. Now, Edith Wilson did not have a hidden agenda. I mean, this is not a woman who has a list of policies that she wants to put into effect when her husband is ill. That's not the case at all. What she wanted to do was protect Wilson from any stress. She wanted to prevent him from resigning, so give him a sense that he was still operating in some way. And she wanted to make sure that things that were vital for the country somehow got done. So she studied every paper. She gave things to various heads of departments with notes scribbled on them. And she decided what was important and what was not. Now, if that's not exercising executive powers, I don't know what is. Despite her defense, you have to understand that Edith Wilson, in a sense, was running the country for several months in terms of deciding what got to Wilson, what got to the heads of department, what issues were considered crucial. So that's her defense. This is the first official photograph after the stroke. It was taken in 1920, and you can see her standing beside him as he's reading something, and as they say, a photograph is worth 1,000 words. I mean, this says it all. Armistice Day in 1921, Wilson did appear in the carriage. He was walking by that time with a cane. Here's another photo of him in 1921, being helped to walk. He never really fully recovered from that major stroke in October. Armistice Day, 1922. And just 2 years later, Woodrow Wilson would die in his sleep. Edith would spend the rest of her life defending his reputation, in a sense, building a monument to him. She stayed quite active. This is a portrait of hers that was done for the National Gallery. Here she is appearing with Eleanor Roosevelt. And here she is with President Taft's brother, and they were at the dedication of the Cottage Museum in Greenbrier in 1932, attending a Girl Scout exhibition with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in 1934. And here she is with John F. Kennedy shortly before her death, signing the Woodrow Wilson Memorial Commission resolution. Today, of course, we have the 25th Amendment, passed in 1967. And it says very clearly, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate and Speaker of the House his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. And this was passed partially to make it clear what would happen if we have a disabled president. The second part of that, whenever the vice president and a majority of either the officers of the executive departments or Congress transmits to the president and the speakers their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers, the vice president assumes the duties. So if you look at this carefully, it's the vice president and a majority of the heads of executive departments or other bodies Congress can provide. They can make the statement that the president is unable to discharge the duties of his or her office, and the vice president takes over. There are many plaques to Edith Bowling Wilson, and as my family will tell you, I never go anywhere without reading plaques. And this one is in her hometown. She, as I said, died soon after that meeting with John F. Kennedy. She died in 1961, and she's interred with Wilson at the National Cathedral. Her birthplace is a museum if you get to Wyethville, Virginia. And the recent book that I was telling you about that I do recommend is the book called Untold Power, The Fascinating Rise and Complex Legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson. It's an easy read and very, very interesting. Rebecca Roberts, in the second selection here, quote, "No one elected Edith. Her actions after Woodrow's stroke were clearly unconstitutional. Her official role as First Lady did not include the duties she took upon herself in 1919 and 1920. But as Edith Wilson said, I'm not thinking of the country, I'm thinking of my husband." And that is the way it was. Now, a couple of things. If she had convinced Wilson to resign, taken that chance, told him the truth about his chances for full recovery, told him how really ill he was, and he had resigned, would the Versailles Treaty have been ratified by the Senate? The United States never ratified the Versailles Treaty. In other words, we never officially ended World War I. Because we never ratified the Versailles Treaty, we never joined the League of Nations. If that had been different when we came into the 1930s, would the fact that the United States was a member of the League of Nations maybe helped prevent war again, prevent Hitler's aggression? It's hard to tell. But without Wilson out of the way, there was no way that that treaty was going to go through. I think that Edith Wilson did, in many ways, assume the powers of the presidency. She ran the government, and she didn't do this out of political ambition. She did this out of protecting Woodrow Wilson. Nonetheless, I have to agree with Rebecca Roberts that her duties were really not constitutional. And so, in many ways, yes, the answer to the question I posed at the beginning of this talk, yes, in some ways, she is our first woman president. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to have questions and comments.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful. Any questions?
Thank you for a good presentation. Excuse me, Larry Lowenthal. How are her actions after his stroke different from those of a chief of staff with powers delegated to her by the executive?
It's an interesting question. How did what she do differ from a chief of staff? A chief of staff, of course, has a lot of influence and power and can determine who gets to see the president. But she did more than that, Larry. I mean, she not only determined who got to see the president, she determined which bills, which problems, which issues went to the president, were to be considered. So I think that she went one step beyond. She wasn't really given the power by Wilson. No, she took the power on the advice of the doctors. That's what she was doing. They were saying to her, you can't make him anxious. You can't let him worry. It will only worsen his condition. So she was acting on the advice, that's her defense. She was acting on the advice of doctors and only bringing to him things that were essential for the running of the country. Not totally at the beginning, no. He did regain much of his mental capacity after about a year, but he was never really quite the same.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Elliot Simon. The question is, can you tell us a little bit about the vice president who would have assumed the office? What was his background? What was his politics?
I can hardly tell you anything about him because people knew nothing about him. He was put on the ticket simply for balance. He was a rather shy, introverted man. He did not want to do it. He made that very clear. So he did not want to take it over. Now, it might have been different if there had been a different kind of vice president, a different man. But you know how vice presidents are often chosen. I mean, Wilson wasn't chosen to the 46th ballot, so, you know, the first time around, so you can imagine not a prominent politician, not somebody I could give a talk on.
Hi, thank you. What became of her business once she got married?
She eventually sold the business.
There's a question on chat here that asks if you'll do Nancy Reagan. And then another question, chat, wasn't she already in a position of great trust with the president, though, before Wilson's strokes?
Yes, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. He regarded her as his trusted advisor, his partner. Remember, he was sending her state documents before they were even officially engaged, before they were married. He was giving her the secret diplomatic code. He absolutely regarded her as his partner. She was very good in Europe because he was aloof and shy, and she was vivacious and friendly, and she charmed European leaders. Yes, if you think about how far this country girl had come, it's quite a journey. At every step of the way, she rose to the occasion. She rose to the occasion of running this jewelry business. She rose to the occasion of advising Wilson before they were married. She rose to the occasion during World War I. I mean, she's presented with a series of challenges. And what I find interesting is that she successfully met all of them.
There's one more chat. So in a way, isn't it Wilson himself rather than Edith who sort of unconstitutionally handed off power to her?
Okay, the question about Wilson unconstitutionally handing off power to her, I don't think he saw it that way.
Okay.
I don't think he was well enough to understand. At the beginning, he certainly, the first 5 months, certainly not well enough to understand. And afterwards, he seemed to be able to look at some of the state papers, and he was a very stubborn man. So much so that, believe it or not, he thought he was going to run for a third term in 1920.
All right, Paul Parker, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. As usual, it was superb and fascinating. And my only question is whether he or she had any direct contacts or interactions with any members of Congress or foreign diplomats or foreign leaders. Did she just operate within the cocoon of the White House and his bedroom?
You mean after the stroke, Paul?
Yeah, after the stroke, of course. Yes.
He did meet with members of Congress several months later. He did appear before Congress several months later, and he did meet with heads of the executive departments once he had recovered enough. And they commented on the fact that his voice seemed different, that he seemed to lose concentration, that he seemed weaker and frail, but he did. As far as foreign diplomats, I don't think so. I don't really have the answer,
Yeah.
to it, but I don't think so.
I think I didn't make myself clear, which I too often. I was talking about Edith Wilson. Did she have any of those
Oh,
contacts?
did she meet?
Yes, not Woodrow.
I don't think she met with any foreign diplomats. And she met with heads of executive departments, handing them notes.
Oh, handing them notes.
Notes,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. That was excellent as usual.
It was.
My question is whether I saw the picture that you had posted there was Eleanor Roosevelt, actually two pictures. Do you think Eleanor Roosevelt was influenced by her role as a very activist first lady prior to Eleanor becoming First Lady?
Oh, what an interesting question, Lynn. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was influenced by Eleanor Roosevelt. Her own activism before she became First Lady. Remember, she was very active as a governor's wife. She was very active in the Democratic Party. And that is a woman with an agenda. Unlike Edith Wilson. And when I get to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and the New Deal next month, that is somebody who had an agenda of her own. And she, I don't know if I've ever seen anything that she wrote about being influenced by Edith Wilson, but it's an interesting question. I'm not sure about that, really.
I think we'll have to wrap it up here. Thank you again, Barbara. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, just one reminder, next week, something totally different because that's what the Wonders are all about. Next week, a group of improv actors, seniors, will be coming in here and doing some improv. It'll be kind of an interactive thing. I think you'll enjoy it. So be sure and come for that. And then just as Barbara said, in just actually 3 weeks, she'll be back here as part of the New Deal course. And her subject will be the role of Eleanor Roosevelt in the New Deal. Don't want to miss that either. Thank you.